Welcome back, everyone, to part 19 of our series, Ancient Mesopotamia, Portrait of a Dead Civilization. We are continuing with Mesopotamian religion, part 5. This is Divination, Communicating with the Gods. Today we're going to look at what was divination, how did the diviners communicate, and how did the gods communicate back, and finally, some of the basics of the techniques that were used. So, what was divination? I thought it would be good to simply quote Oppenheim here, as his definition is actually precise and very useful. A technique of communication with the supernatural forces that are supposed to shape the history of the individual as well as that of the group. It presumes the belief that these powers are able and, at times, willing to communicate their intentions, and that they are interested in the well-being of the individual or the group. In other words, that if evil is predicted or threatened, it can be averted by appropriate means. In short, what he's saying is that the gods, the Sumerian, the Mesopotamian pantheon, was both transcendent in that they were outside and above, separate from humanity, but they were also immanent in the sense that they were concerned about individuals, they were concerned about the people groups, and that they were willing and able, depending on the circumstances, to communicate either their good or bad intentions, or willing to answer questions about the success of a venture or the future prospects of someone's love intention, or any of these issues that the people were able to ask the gods about. So there was this immanence, this relationship in a sense that the gods would have with both the individuals and the people. So, often you will see a king asking the gods, should I go on this campaign? Will I win if I go fight this group? The person that was responsible for being the liaison, the intermediary between the gods and the person asking the question, was the diviner. He had scholarly training in how to read the signs, how to interpret them, how to ask the questions correctly in order to get responses from the gods that were reliable. And so this is the art of divination. And today and Friday, we're going to be looking at some of the specifics of how divination took place. So how did the gods communicate? Well, there were two ways. Provoked communication and unprovoked communication. In other words, communication that was solicited by the diviner on behalf of the individual or the group, and communication that the gods simply made in and of themselves through natural phenomena without being asked. So provoked, asking specific questions or requesting signs that would portend certain types of future events, whether they be good or bad. And then unprovoked, natural phenomena in the world around them that would be interpreted by a particular code. So, let's put this in more understandable terms, in case it's not understandable. This is the difference between asking your teacher or your professor a question about something in the homework specifically, which would be a provoked form of communication. Excuse me, Professor so-and-so, how many questions will be on the exam on Friday? That would be a provoked communication. Unprovoked would be you're sitting in class and your professor comes up and says, I need you to know that you're going to fail this semester if you don't do better on your homework. That would be unprovoked, something that the professor decided to take it upon themselves to communicate information to you, particularly about the future. And that's sort of what's going on here. The gods could be asked specific questions, and they could also communicate in an unprovoked way through the natural world. Now, how would these signs, how would the answers to these questions or this communication that was unprovoked be interpreted? How would it be understood by the people? Well, this is where the diviner, the Akkadian Baru, this is where he would come in. There were these long lists of omens, the Latin for warning. These omen compendia, they dated from the 2nd and 1st millennia, and they essentially were long lists of, if this happens, then this will happen. And we'll talk about this more on Friday, but these are the means by which the diviners were able to interpret the communication of the deities. So some of the techniques, Oppenheim lists operational divination and magical technique. So operational divination would be direct questions. So he says, quote, "The diviner offers the deity the opportunity of directly affecting an object activated by the diviner." Basically what he means is the diviner would take an object, and we'll talk about what those are in some more detail on Friday. I list a couple here. But he would activate, he would ritually prepare and, what's another word for activate here? He would prepare and set in place, maybe, ritually, an object on which the god could act. So here, this is it's a type of provoked question, or a provoked communication, because the diviner is asking the question. He's requesting that the god act upon, for example, oil that is poured on water. So oil would move along the surface of the water, and the way that the oil appeared on the water, the shape or the movement, this would be interpreted by the diviner as communication by the god. Also, if there was a censer and smoke emanated from it, and it was activated ritually by the diviner, then the god could move the smoke around in whatever way he or she saw fit, in order to communicate a message to the diviner or to the individual through the diviner. So the god manipulates the oil and or the smoke to send a message to the person making the request. Another technique he calls the magical technique. The deity produces changes in natural phenomena, that is, wind, thunder, and the movement of the stars. These are examples. Or affects the behavior or the external or internal features of animals and even human beings, end quote. So essentially, these are generally speaking, unprovoked. They can be provoked. We'll talk about this later. But they're, these natural phenomena are often unprovoked things. But something happens. For example, there's an eclipse, or the stars have a certain feature, or a particular type of storm occurs, and this is taken and interpreted by the diviner as a message from the gods that can be interpreted and relayed to humanity, to the people. So, for example, an eclipse often indicated that the king was going to die, let's say, and so certain things could be done to prevent that. We'll talk about that in just a second. These can be provoked or unprovoked, and again, the omen lists are used to interpret the signs, and so that they could be understood correctly. So in summation, two-way communication was available to ancient Mesopotamian diviners, and thus to the people. Gods could respond to questions or could portend good or evil through natural phenomena, and the omen lists provided the diviner the means to interpret the signs from the gods. Interestingly enough, this, as you see, for example, in the book of Daniel, this places the king or whoever is making the request of the gods at the mercy of the intermediary, right? So he has to trust the intermediary that they are interpreting not only correctly, but they're not lying or manipulating the answer to suit their own intentions. And so you see in the case of the Neo-Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, one of the things that he does is he's known for setting up this library. Part of the reason he does this is so that he can bring all of these omen compendia and all of these means of interpreting the signs from the gods into one place, so that he can, in a sense, check, at least verify that some of these things that were being said by the diviners were accurate or true. And there's something else I was going to talk about. Oh, well. So that is an introduction to the ways in which the gods could communicate with humanity. Oh, that's what I was going to say. Just because an ominous event was predicted or warned about through a sign, that does not mean that event was necessarily going to take place. In other words, there were certain rituals that could be done. There were certain actions that could be taken on the part of the individual or the group that could avert that disaster, avert that event that was portended, that was to take place from the gods. So a good example, and we have a video on this in our daily data, is the substitute king ritual. So if an eclipse happened, for example, which portended the death of the king, a substitute king could be ritually put in place, and that would allow the gods to exact that penalty, or not even penalty. They could take out they could perform that action, that death, that killing, on the substitute king in order to fulfill that predicted event, and not actually do it on the real quote unquote king, and that would allow that disaster to be averted as far as the actual king was concerned. And so there were rituals that could be done to ward off the evil, to ward off the coming disaster. And so that was a significant portion of understanding these communications. So a significant reason for making these communications, so that they could actually avert the disaster that was to come about. So on Friday, we're going to look at divination part 2, some of the more specific means of communication. So we've looked at oil and water and smoke, but there were other things, many other ways that communication took place, and we're going to take a look at those in a bit more detail, so stay with us. Until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that?